holes, hides, and hopeless gaps. Before we had doors, we had holes. Literal, actual holes in cliffs, in trees, in walls, in our plans. The earliest humans didn't think in terms of interior and exterior. They thought in terms of where it doesn't rain and where something might eat me. That's how architectural priorities started, not with style, but with fear. Sensible, primal, damp fear. These early shelters, caves, lean-tos, hollow logs, and ambitious bushes, had no formal entries. They simply had openings. Some were low, some were wide. All were inconvenient. But what mattered was that they weren't entirely open. That was shelter. That was home. The first door-like objects were not doors at all. They were suggestions. A pile of rocks in front of a hole, a stretched animal hide draped awkwardly over a frame, a bunch of sticks arranged in a shape that might have been defensive or just lazy kindling. These weren't designed to keep things out. They were designed to imply that someone lived there. It was prehistoric signage, occupied, but with fur and gravity. Animal hides were popular because they were soft, floppy, and abundant, and dead. Mostly dead. A hide over a cave entrance said, "I tried," while also saying, "Please don't ask what's behind this." They moved in the wind. They absorbed the smell of everything. They also never quite fit the frame because there was no frame. On windy days, your home flapped at you. On rainy days, it wept. And on nights when the fire smoked too much, it turned into a lung-clogging curtain of suffering. But it beat sleeping under a tree. Then there were the rocks. Prehistoric people loved large rocks. They dragged them across doorways, wedged them into gaps, and occasionally stacked them as if trying to reinvent the concept of frustration. These prehistoric security stones were heavy, unpredictable, and impossible to operate quietly. No one could sneak out. No one could sneak in. And once the rock was in place, you were either committed to staying inside or very strong. It is entirely possible that the first door was simply a mistake no one corrected. And yet, these primitive coverings evolved. In some Neolithic cultures, clay and mud brick structures were built without front entrances at all. Instead, access came from the top. People climbed down into their homes via roof holes, using ladders, ropes, or something vaguely ladder-like and highly splintery. Çatalhöyük, a sprawling Neolithic settlement in present-day Turkey, is the best-known example of this. Homes were jammed together like a game of muddy Tetris. Each had a roof hole, and people climbed in from above like archaeologically confused burglars. This method had its benefits. No side door meant no draft. No opening on the ground meant no predators. And no hinges meant no door-related maintenance for 6,000 years. Inside, homes were smoky, dark, and loud. You could hear your neighbor arguing about grain through the wall. You could smell what they were cooking. You could occasionally fall into their house if you weren't paying attention. Community in its purest, most inconvenient form. What passed for entry security was the ladder itself. Pull it up, and no one could follow. Except for someone with a slightly longer ladder, or better balance, or motivation. These early shelters didn't have keys. They didn't need locks. They had friction, and shame, and deeply unergonomic design. There was no such thing as knocking. You announced yourself by yelling down the hole. Sometimes a rock was tossed through it as a message. Sometimes that was the message. But make no mistake, this was the beginning, the birth of the concept of entrance. People began to understand that the space between outside and inside meant something, even if it was just a strip of hide and a rock. A place could be yours. It could have an edge, a boundary, a way in, a way out. and for a while, that was enough. Roof entrances and prehistoric security. For a surprisingly long period in human history, the safest way to enter your home was through the ceiling. It wasn't because people loved climbing or because ladders were trendy. It was because side doors were a structural nightmare and burglars hadn't yet invented upper body strength. So roof holes became the standard entrance, the prehistoric version of a skylight that leads to your kitchen. At Catalhuyuk and similar Neolithic settlements, people lived in houses with no front door, no doorbell, no welcome mat, just a square hole in the roof and a ladder made of wood and optimism. These weren't luxury homes. They were mud brick rectangles crammed next to each other like roommates that never got along. Your roof was your neighbor's sidewalk, and your entrance was their tripping hazard. Entering your own house was an act of coordination. You climbed a wooden ladder while carrying baskets of grain, possibly a goat, and your own dignity. You then had to lower yourself, carefully, into the dark interior below without stepping on a family member or the fire pit. Some did this with grace. Others became anecdotes. Inside the house, the roof holes served as entry, chimney, ventilation, and occasional bird portal. Rain came in, smoke went out, sometimes. The air was rich with the scent of ash, stew, and mild domestic tension. Roof entrances became a kind of passive security system. Pull up the ladder and no one could enter unless they brought their own. This led to what historians call the world's least effective arms race, involving slightly longer ladders. When someone wanted to visit, they'd shout down through the hole, or drop something, or just climb in and apologize later. There were no locks. There was only momentum. For storage, people placed their best belongings far from the hole, just in case. This included tools, dried meats, ceremonial objects, and whatever counted as valuable when currency hadn't been invented yet, possibly a shiny rock. The ladder itself was more than just furniture. It was a symbol of status. If you had your own, you were independent. If you had two, you were suspicious. If you had none, you were stuck. Entire families may have been defined by who had ladder access and who didn't. Children learned to climb before they learned to walk properly. Guests were judged by how gracefully they descended. And if someone knocked over your only ladder, that could be interpreted as a declaration of war. Eventually, people began placing covers over their roof holes. Sometimes a slab of wood, sometimes a woven mat, sometimes a loose basket held down by a rock and a prayer. These weren't secure, but they suggested that you had thought about security. There is no evidence of doorways being guarded, unless you count Grandma sitting on the roof with a stick. But what roof entrances lacked in elegance, they made up for in elevation. The very act of climbing made you feel like you were earning your shelter, like you were ascending into warmth, into the heart of your household, into smoke. Today, climbing into your house would be considered inconvenient, bizarre, and potentially illegal. Back then, it was just Tuesday. The first thresholds and symbolic barriers. At some point in prehistory, a curious thought occurred. What if the place where you enter actually mattered? This was the birth of the threshold. Not a door, not even a covering, just a line. Sometimes a raised ridge of clay. Sometimes a rock placed horizontally. Sometimes a different colored patch of floor that may or may not have been dried goat urine. Archaeology isn't always clear. Whatever it was, it divided the outside from the inside. It said in its own small earthen way, "You are now somewhere." Early thresholds weren't structural, they were symbolic. A separation of space, purpose, and, occasionally, hygiene. The area beyond the threshold was sacred, or warmer, or just where the fire pit was. In many early settlements, crossing the threshold came with meaning. Visitors were expected to pause, look down, and sometimes mutter something like a greeting, or an apology, or the equivalent of, "I'm stepping over now, please don't throw things." Stepping over someone's threshold without permission could be seen as a microaggression or a full-on insult, depending on how heavy your feet were. This was the prehistoric version of knock before entering, only there was nothing to knock on, and instead of knocking, you just tripped over something and hoped someone noticed. Over time, thresholds grew more elaborate. In Mesopotamia, archaeologists found baked clay strips placed across door openings. Raised, deliberate, and exactly the kind of object a sleepy person would trip over in the dark. Civilization was arriving, one stubbed toe at a time. Some thresholds had symbols etched into them. Little marks, scratchings. Maybe religious, maybe decorative, maybe just someone trying to pass the time with a rock. But once something is carved in clay, it becomes sacred, at least to future museum placards. Offerings were sometimes placed at thresholds, grains, bones, fruit, or teeth. It's unclear if this was meant for spirits, guests, or nosy animals. Either way, it transformed the humble doorway into a zone of transition, the prehistoric cousin of a porch, without the chairs. In early homes, the threshold also helped keep dirt out, or in. Honestly, probably both. What mattered was the gesture. This side is domestic. That side is chaos. Even today, in some cultures, stepping directly onto a threshold is bad luck. You're supposed to step over it as a sign of respect. This idea goes back thousands of years, to the moment someone tripped and decided it had to mean something. The threshold didn't open. It didn't swing. It didn't click shut. But it divided. And it declared. And that was enough for now. Before hinges, before locks, before doors, there was the line, the sacred bump, the inconvenient obstacle that said, "You're in." Egypt's wooden statements of intent. The first real doors didn't arrive with a bang. They arrived with a groan, a slow, dragging wooden groan. Ancient Egypt didn't invent the door, but it gave it a job and possibly the first sense of self-importance. Before that, doors were just obstacles. After Egypt, they were architecture. Barely. The earliest Egyptian doors were large, heavy slabs of wood mounted vertically using simple pivots. No hinges, no knobs. Just a carved hole at the top and bottom fitted onto posts. These doors spun, but reluctantly. It was less a rotation and more a sigh. Some historians call this the first swinging door, though that's generous. These didn't swing. They rotated like a sand-filled bookshelf. They were made of local acacia or imported cedar, woods that splintered, warped, and absorbed everything. A hot Egyptian summer could make your door twice as wide and 3 times more resentful. But they worked, and they mattered, mostly because people decided they should. In tombs, the Egyptians developed false doors, symbolic entrances carved in stone that no one could walk through. These were portals for the dead. Not ghosts, not ghouls, just respectfully summoned spirits who, presumably, appreciated decent masonry. The false door wasn't just decoration, it was sacred. Priests placed offerings before it, families visited it, and everyone agreed to pretend that it led somewhere meaningful. It was the ultimate metaphor, a door you couldn't open to a place you couldn't reach. Meanwhile, in living homes, doors served more practical, if still clunky purposes. Grain stores had doors. Workshops had doors. Some homes had more than one, which archaeologists interpret as either wealth or chronic indecision. There were no locks in the modern sense, but some doors had a bar system. A thick beam slid into place behind brackets to prevent opening. It worked well enough that robbers would just go through the wall instead. Still, Egyptians began carving elaborate frames around doors. Not the door itself, just the outline. The entrance became symbolic, a status marker. This household values wood, symmetry, and the illusion of privacy. In wealthier buildings, double doors appeared. Two panels meeting in the middle like they were conspiring. Closing them took effort. Opening them took servants. Standing near them made you feel important and dusty. The sound of these doors was also legendary. There were no oil hinges, just raw wood, stone pivots, and heat. A door closing in Egypt was less a click and more of a wooden groan of eternal suffering. It echoed down sandstone hallways. It let you know something was happening, or that someone had failed to secure the beam again. What Egyptians lacked in efficiency, they made up for in commitment to symbolism. A door was never just a door. It was a passage, a threshold, an interface between the sacred and the mundane, even if it mostly just separated a hallway from some grain. So while their doors weren't fast or quiet or pleasant, they meant something. And thousands of years later, we're still walking through that idea. Slowly, loudly, with reverence, or at least with splinters. Mesopotamian bureaucracy and tablet doors. If Egypt gave the door meaning, Mesopotamia gave it paperwork. No civilization embraced the intersection of architecture and bureaucracy quite like ancient Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon. These were people who believed that everything should be recorded, including, apparently, who was allowed to walk through which door, when, and why. Clay tablets from the 3rd millennium BCE include contracts for homes, permissions for storage, and regulations for access. We even have receipts for bricks. And among these endless logs of who owed whom how much goat, doors began to appear in the margins. There are tablets that simply say, door, 1 unit. Not which door, not where, just door, which is beautiful. Some inscriptions are more poetic. Let no one enter who is not summoned. The earliest known example of do not disturb, written in cuneiform. Mesopotamian doors were often made of palm wood, which warped easily, cracked in the heat, and occasionally housed spiders large enough to be considered roommates. Yet they served as the gateway between the public and private, even if private was just a room with a goat and a pot. These doors were sometimes framed by large vertical stone blocks or doorposts that were inscribed with warnings. Not functional ones like mind the step, but ceremonial curses. May he who breaks this seal be consumed by the river god. Strong words for a door that opens to a broom closet. But this wasn't about functionality. It was about authority. A door in Mesopotamia was an extension of law, not because it locked, but because someone had written down that it should not be opened. There's something beautifully pointless about that. In temples, doors became administrative checkpoints. Priests controlled who entered sacred spaces. Clay seal impressions show names, dates, and approvals. Some show that certain doors were only opened on lunar cycles, others that only specific people could stand near them. Imagine being a guard for a door that opens once a month for one person who might not come. That's Mesopotamian energy. In palaces, doors were used as spatial filters. You couldn't just walk into the king's hall. You had to go through 3 doors, each more elaborate, more documented, and more symbolically unnecessary than the last. Even warehouses had door regulations. Grain storage was protected not by locks, but by scribes. If you took grain without a tablet authorizing grain removal, you had committed door violation, a real thing, punishable by public shaming or worse, more paperwork. And still, these doors weren't advanced. Most had no hinges, some used pegs. Some were simple hanging mats or reed weaves. Many didn't close flush. A few were simply there to remind you that you were supposed to pause. That was the real power, not the barrier, but the expectation. And if you crossed through without permission, someone wrote that down. Mesopotamia may not have made better doors, but it defined the rules around them. Not how to build them, but how to fear them. And sometimes, that's more effective. The rise of hinges and the concept of swing. At some point in architectural history, someone looked at a massive, dragging wooden plank and thought, what if this moved better? That was the moment humanity invented the hinge. A mechanical pivot, a controlled axis, a chance to turn suffering into inconvenience. The earliest known hinges weren't made of metal, they were stone sockets, holes drilled into stone thresholds and lintels where wooden pins from the top and bottom of a door could nestle and rotate. It wasn't elegant, it was primitive, but it worked, eventually. This system is what archaeologists refer to as a pivot hinge, which is generous. It didn't pivot so much as groan in a circle. Still, it was an upgrade from dragging the whole thing aside like a reluctant cow. The swing was born, and nothing was ever the same again, except everything. Because most people still used sticks and curtains. But in better-built homes, temples, and state buildings, hinge doors started to spread. At first, they were huge, 2 meters tall, thick slabs of wood designed more to impress than to move. If you could open one without assistance, you either worked there or were considered suspicious. These doors had no handles. You just pulled, or pushed, or kicked, depending on status. Some civilizations began attaching leather straps or woven cord to help guide the swing. Others wrapped the pins in copper to reduce friction. This helped for about 4 hours. Then the sand got in. In hot climates, wood swelled, hinges cracked, doors stuck. It was a system built for symbolic movement, not practical access. But it allowed for something new. Drama. Now you could fling a door open, slam it shut, stand just inside and peer through the crack while suspicious music played in your imagination. Doors became emotional architecture. They also became annoying. Now they could swing into things, hit things, be left ajar, creak, slam in the wind. New problems, beautiful problems. In some Mesopotamian temples, doors were fitted with metal sockets, actual bronze or copper castings, to support the pivot pin. This was considered high-end. Possibly the first time in history someone admired a door for its hardware. It didn't take long for hinges to spread. Across cultures, you begin to see carved door frames with curved wear patterns, signs that doors were being opened and closed regularly, even eagerly. But let's be clear, most homes still had no hinges at all. They used reed mats, hide flaps, or makeshift panels that leaned and hoped for the best. Hinged doors were for buildings that mattered, temples, grain houses, bureaucratic nightmares. This division between places with hinges and places without may be the origin of the modern office-home separation. If your door could swing, people assumed you had opinions. With the hinge came expectation that you'd open the door gently, that you'd close it behind you, that you respected the sound it made, and oh, the sound. Hinges squeaked, moaned, screamed. In some texts, ancient doors are described as crying or complaining. Poets gave them voices. Priests gave them names. One Babylonian poem speaks of a temple gate that sings at dawn. Translation: someone needed oil. The hinge didn't just make doors better, it made them alive. And once they moved, they never stopped. Greek Stoicism and the unmoved door. To the ancient Greeks, doors weren't just functional, they were philosophical. A doorway wasn't merely the place you walked through, it was a space between spaces, an in-betweenness, a threshold where the self could question reality, or at the very least whether someone was home. The Greeks built beautiful entrances, stone columns, lintels, decorative carvings, inscriptions, and yet, the doors themselves? Mostly wood, heavy, simple, unadorned. The door was plain. The frame was poetry. That's Greece in a nutshell. Homes in classical Athens were designed with inward-facing courtyards, The front of the house faced the street, but the windows were high and small. The door, large, noticeable, but rarely open. Privacy mattered. Appearances mattered more. The threshold stone, the marble sill beneath the door, was often more valuable than the door itself. It gleamed. It was polished. It was stepped over with intention, and sometimes regret. People didn't just enter homes, they were admitted. Knocking was not universal yet. In fact, shouting outside someone's house was more common than tapping. It wasn't considered rude, it was considered efficient. "Hello, I'm here, can I enter?" Followed by a pause, followed by silence, followed by you leaving. Greek literature treats doors with surprising seriousness. In Euripides' plays, doors are described as agents of tension. In Homer, they're boundaries of fate, and in some legal texts, the location of your door determined your taxes. This may explain why some people build houses with weird corners and very creative definitions of front. Temples had doors too, often enormous, bronze-plated, and entirely symbolic. Some couldn't open, some shouldn't. One in Delphi had engraved messages telling you what not to do, the first ancient Greek terms of service. But inside homes, doors were utilitarian. They didn't have knobs, they had latches, bars, and ropes. Some had door slaves, yes, literal humans tasked with opening and closing doors for guests, which is either a security system or the world's slowest button. The Greek word for door, thura, appears in hundreds of inscriptions. In poetry, in contracts, in curses, one inscription on a doorpost reads, "May no evil cross this line," which was probably ignored, frequently. Philosophers loved doors. Diogenes famously lived in a barrel, which had no door. Socrates said a man who understands his door does not fear the street. This was considered deep. Today, it would be a tweet. There's little evidence that Greek doors locked from the inside. The solution? Push a heavy object in front of it and hope for the best, or sleep with one eye open and two sandals in hand. But even without hinges or elegance or mechanisms of wonder, Greek doors meant something. They held ideas, they held status, and most importantly, they held people out, or in, depending on the size of the rock behind them. Roman domus and the portal of rank. To the Romans, the front door wasn't just an entrance. It was a public relations campaign. You could tell everything about a Roman citizen by their door. Its height, its width, its material, whether it groaned politely or screamed like a cursed chariot. In the domus, the traditional Roman townhouse, the front door opened into the atrium, a grand central space designed for maximum dramatic entry. There were statues, pools, skylights, but first you had to pass through a door that practically shouted, "This house has opinions." Roman doors were usually made of wood, sometimes double-paneled, and occasionally covered in bronze or iron strips. They opened inward, which was symbolic, practical, and great for unexpected shoulder injuries. The doorframe often featured carved messages or guardian spirits, known as lares, etched in stone to protect the home. Some inscriptions warned thieves, others simply boasted. One famously read, "You may enter, but know that I see you," which today would just be a Ring doorbell. Wealthier homes employed porters, servants who stood by the door, announced visitors, and decided who got to come in. The doorman was not optional. He was the filter between the outside world and your mosaic flooring. Roman law even recognized the door as a boundary of personal space and legal identity. Crossing someone's threshold without permission could lead to serious consequences: fines, feuds, or formal complaints written on wax tablets in very angry Latin. Inside the home, doors separated rooms by function and rank. The door to the tablinum, the master's office, was wide and often left open to signify power. The door to the slave quarters was not. Privacy was scarce, but hierarchy was everywhere. Even in death, Romans loved doors. Tombs were built with stone doors carved to look like they could open. These false doors echoed Egyptian tradition, but with a twist. Many were carved with door knockers, as if the dead might expect guests, or just one very specific tax collector. Temples had massive ceremonial doors that were opened only on special occasions. The most famous, the Gates of Janus, a temple whose doors were closed only in times of peace. Spoiler, they were almost always open. Locks and keys began to emerge more clearly in Roman times. Small iron locks could secure chests or doors, usually operated with large, awkward keys carried on rings, belts, or in togas, which had no pockets. So, really, everything was awkward. But the key was more than a tool. It became a symbol of authority. Wives were sometimes given a key as a wedding gift, signifying they controlled the household, or at least the grain cupboard. Romans were among the first to understand that a door wasn't just about closing something off. It was about what people thought when they saw it. A Roman front door didn't say, "Welcome." It said, "Observe." And then, maybe, "Don't touch the statue." Locking mechanisms and the invention of privacy. It took thousands of years of civilization for someone to say, "I want to be alone, and I want to make it difficult for others to stop me." And thus, the door lock was born. Not in its modern form, not yet, but in its earliest splintery wooden awkwardness. The first known locking mechanisms appeared in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, but the Romans turned it into an industry. They had keys, they had wards, they had tiny padlocks and large clunky bolts. They even had key fobs, which in this case meant a literal chunk of metal tied to your belt. Privacy, once a vague concept based on yelling "go away," became a physical reality. Most Roman locks used a pin and tumbler system made from wood or bronze. A sliding wooden bar inside the door would drop into notches, and only the correct key, a long stick with pegs in the right shape, could lift the pins to open it. It was simple, elegant, and completely ineffective if someone just pushed hard enough. But it was the intention that mattered. Lockable doors began showing up on chests, storehouses, interior rooms, and eventually, bedchambers. The bedroom lock, of course, being both symbolic and practical. Nothing says power couple like a giant iron key on a rope necklace. Keys themselves became status items. The bigger the key, the more important the lock, or the worse the engineering. Upper-class women wore keys as part of their jewelry. Not because they needed to lock things, but because it looked like they had things worth locking. This was privacy as performance art. In some Roman cities, locksmiths opened shops. Advertisements scratched into walls promised security, discretion, and no questions asked, which is exactly what you want from a man selling door parts in a toga. But privacy wasn't universal. In multi-family apartments, insulae, doors had no locks. Or they did, but everyone knew how to break them. Renters used props: a jar, a stick, a chair, a sleeping dog. Personal space was negotiated, not enforced. Still, the idea had taken root. I can own space, and I can control access to it. And once you had a door that locked, you also had a reason to knock. Knocking, as a custom, likely evolved from the sound of open palms on wood. But knocking with expectation, that was new. You knocked, you waited, you were judged. You were either admitted, ignored, or asked to leave by a voice behind wood. Society had arrived. Some scholars suggest that the invention of the lock is what gave rise to personal secrets, because now you could hide things, lock them away, whisper behind a closed door and know, for the first time in history, that someone couldn't immediately walk in and ask what you were talking about, unless they had a spare key, which, in Rome, they probably did. Still, the lock changed everything. It created the possibility of inside without outside, of known without seen, of me without you, at least until dinner. The invention of locking mechanisms gave us privacy, power, theft, secrecy, jealousy, miscommunication, and eventually, passwords. So really, it all went downhill from here. Castles, drawbridges, and timber portals. If the Romans gave doors status, the Middle Ages gave them armor. Castles weren't built for beauty, they were built for survival. And that meant big doors, not just big in size, but in purpose. A door in a castle was no longer a social symbol. It was a literal defense system. These were not doors in the household sense. They were gates, portals, barricades, made of thick oak iron studs, and enough creaking misery to wake a kingdom. Sometimes they weren't even doors. They were just vertical walls that moved, slowly, and with regret. The front gate of a castle often had two layers, a drawbridge which could be raised, and a portcullis, a heavy iron grate that dropped like the mood in a medieval dining hall. The actual door behind that was made of reinforced wood, bolted, barred, and, more often than not, left closed. Not locked, closed, because if someone got that far, locks were pointless. To enter a castle was to pass through layers of intention. A moat, a bridge, a tunnel, a gatehouse, a portcullis, and finally, a door that looked like it could end your week. And if you made it inside, congratulations, there were more doors. Interior doors weren't built for charm. They were heavy, hinged with iron straps, often set into stone walls that sweated. Most didn't open easily. Some didn't open at all. They just groaned, forever. The average medieval door in a castle was loud, slow, and difficult. And that was the point. If it was easy to open, someone would open it. This was the era of intentional resistance. A good door didn't obey. It challenged. And when doors couldn't resist, they were backed up with bars, wedges, and sometimes entire piles of furniture. Security wasn't a mechanism. It was a lifestyle. Doorways were narrow on purpose, so attackers had to come in one at a time. Some were angled or offset, not for design but to prevent charging. Many were arched to support the stone above, but also to make you feel like something important was happening when you entered. And sometimes it was. Doors in chapels and great halls were different. They were decorated. They had carvings. They might even have had a message, a crest, a saint, or a strange face sticking its tongue out. This was not just medieval humor, it was door attitude. In manors and townhouses, doors got a little more personal. Still made of timber, still strapped in iron, but with more flair. Sometimes with knockers, often with bolts, and occasionally with slits to peek through in case someone was trying to sell you a goat. But even these domestic doors were built with suspicion in mind. They were designed to keep something out. Wolves, bandits, cousins, feelings. Privacy was becoming a practical concern, not just a noble one. And with the rise of guilds, merchant homes, and urban walls, doors were now everywhere. Not just in castles, but in cities. And with that came the next great innovation. The door that locks and looks good. But we're not there yet. We're still in a cold hallway pushing against damp oak, hoping it doesn't squeak too loud. Monastery silence doors. There is no door more ironic than a monastery door, because it opens into a place of silence, while usually making a sound like someone dragging a coffin full of hymnals. Monastic doors weren't made for drama. They were made for stillness, simplicity, obedience. And yet, every monastery built in the Middle Ages had doors that announced themselves like thunderclaps. Thick wood, iron hinges, massive latches, and above all, echoes. So many echoes. The typical monastery door had a job. Keep the world out, let humility in, and creak. Always creak, no matter what oil you tried. But the purpose of these doors was more than security. It was about intention. To enter a monastery meant leaving something behind. Your name, your possessions, your ego, and often your ability to open a door without help. The main entrance was symbolic, large, arched, and set into stone so old it had no memory of sunlight. You didn't just walk in, you submitted. There were no greeters, no welcome signs, just a knock, a pause, and a monk on the other side deciding, in complete silence, whether you look sufficiently disappointed in the world. Inside, doors were everywhere. They weren't marked. They weren't labeled. You were supposed to know where you were going, or not care. Chambers were separated by heavy timber doors set low into thick walls. Most didn't lock, but they didn't have to. Because if you opened one too fast, everyone knew, not because they saw you, but because the building itself would speak. Clunk, snap, and then silence again, like nothing had happened. Except now Brother Thomas was awake and slightly holier than before. Some monastery doors had portals within portals, tiny cutouts in the larger door, allowing access without fully opening it. This served two purposes. Preserve the peace. Make sure no one snuck in looking for cheese. Privacy wasn't the goal. Stillness was. But doors helped enforce both. And for outsiders, there was the turning box, a wooden cylinder embedded in the wall. You placed an object inside, spun it, and the other side would take it. No voices, no eye contact, just rotating humility. Monasteries didn't need locks because shame did the work. If you walked into the wrong place, you knew, not because someone scolded you, but because the door had clearly told on you. Even the architecture respected the vow of silence, and so the doors became agents of selective access. They controlled sound. They controlled space. And they reminded you, gently and loudly, that you were not in charge. The village door and the rise of the public threshold. Not every door in the Middle Ages belonged to a castle. Most of them belonged to people who could never afford a castle. The typical medieval village door was simple, wooden boards nailed together, sometimes reinforced with a crossbeam, and, if you were lucky, a latch that sort of worked when it wasn't raining, which meant it almost never worked. These doors weren't built for battle. They were built for drafts, dogs, and daily bread. The door to your cottage marked the edge of your dignity. On one side, your straw bed, your soup, your exhausted family. On the other, mud, chickens, gossip, and the tax collector. Village doors were where life happened. You talked through them. You shouted through them. You sometimes opened them just to see if the neighbor across the way had also opened theirs, which meant something was happening. They were often left ajar, not out of carelessness, but out of habit. People were in and out constantly, fetching water, letting out livestock, yelling at someone. If your door was closed all day, it meant one of two things: you were dead, or avoiding someone you owed eggs to. Craftsmen had distinctive doors. The carpenter's door might have a decorative carving. The blacksmith's door might be metal reinforced, a humble brag. The baker's door smelled better than yours. Over time, as towns developed, doors began facing streets rather than fields. And this changed everything. Because now, the door was visible, not just to neighbors, but to everyone. The public threshold became a statement. Here lives someone organized. Here lives someone who sweeps. Here lives someone who can't afford hinges but tried anyway. This gave rise to the first true domestic architecture of pride. Colorful doors, painted frames, curtains, wreaths, signs. It wasn't just about function anymore, it was presentation. In taverns and inns, doors became invitation. Large, swinging, sometimes double, they were propped open during market hours and shut tight after sundown. If a door creaked, the innkeeper noticed. If a door slammed, the barmaid judged you. And if you walked into the wrong door in a back alley, well, there was no Yelp, just experience. Some homes had small sliding hatches, not for decoration, but for checking who was knocking. You opened it, saw a face, and made a choice. Close it, open the latch, or say nothing and hope they assumed you were at the mill. This was privacy in its earliest accessible form. Not for the rich, not for the sacred, but for the everyday person who just wanted a minute of quiet before opening the door to more responsibility. And that's what these village doors gave people. Not security, not even warmth, but control, even if only a Renaissance drama in 2 panels. The Renaissance was a time of humanism, rebirth, art, and science, and also extremely over-designed doors. This was the first era where the door became a statement piece, not just a barrier, but a canvas. And what it said was, "Look how wealthy, tasteful, and possibly Italian I am." In Florence, doors were carved with biblical scenes, floral spirals, muscular angels, and, in some cases, the entire family tree of the homeowner. Because nothing says subtlety like 12 generations of Egidio sculpted into walnut. Double doors became fashionable again, not because anyone needed 2, but because 1 simply wasn't enough for your ego, your horse, and your furniture to pass through simultaneously. These doors were tall. They were arched. They had panels, moldings, decorative knockers the size of a toddler, and hinges designed to look like they were forged by Michelangelo himself. And they were loud. Not physically, symbolically. To walk through a Renaissance door was to enter art. To be framed, literally, like a painting in motion. A portal that made your arrival seem meaningful, even if you were just late to lunch. Palazzos, grand Renaissance homes, were built with massive stone doorways often set into facades more detailed than modern cathedrals. The door might be the least decorated part of the building, but only because the rest was trying to outshine it. Even modest homes took part. Simple wooden doors were adorned with etched initials, painted borders, iron studs. You couldn't afford a sculpture? Paint your name in Latin and pretend it's ancient. And it wasn't just homes. Shops began using doors as advertising. A green door for an apothecary, a red one for a butcher. And black? Well, that meant nobody paid the rent that month. Inside buildings, doors began dividing space more deliberately. Not just rooms, but functions. Study, parlor, music chamber, dining hall, secret staircase. Each door suggested that the space behind it mattered. That you shouldn't just walk through casually. You should pause and maybe fix your collar. This was also the beginning of door symmetry obsession. Everything had to match. The handle, the frame, the panel pattern. If one corner warped, the whole house felt off balance. Architects began drawing entire buildings around the front door. In Venice, you had doors that opened directly onto water, so you could step from your gondola onto marble with grace, or fall in if your timing was off. The door became a stage, an announcement, a performance, and the people who built them knew it. Baroque excess, and the door that needed a translator. If Renaissance doors were art, then Baroque doors were operas. Louder, heavier, gilded, more concerned with drama than function, more interested in impressing you than letting you in. The Baroque period, 17th to 18th century, believed that nothing should be subtle, especially not the thing you stare at while waiting for someone to answer. The result? Doors that looked like they had personalities, and sometimes health conditions. The frames were huge, the moldings violent, the pediments aggressively triangular. Everything had to swirl, everything had to curve. And if your front door didn't feature a face carved into something, were you even nobility? Baroque doors often featured broken pediments where the decorative triangle or arch above the door was sliced in half, for style, for drama, for architectural suspense, as if the building were halfway through yelling something. Above many doors were carved putti, those chubby baby angels, who seemed very invested in your decision to enter the foyer. One pointed, another wept. One just stared blankly, possibly judging your shoes. And if that wasn't enough, the door might also include Latin inscriptions, floral garlands, carved lions, a full coat of arms, and sometimes a saint who clearly didn't ask to be involved. Knockers got heavier, handles got stranger, and doorbells didn't exist yet, so people just kept knocking until their hand hurt or the door opened from guilt. Doors were now designed to overwhelm. You were supposed to feel something: awed, dwarfed, confused, maybe all three. Inside, things weren't simpler. Every room had a matching door, paneled, gilded, trimmed with the emotional energy of a Rococo violin solo. Even the closet door felt like it should come with a backstory. In palaces, doors weren't just for rooms. They were for processions. You didn't walk through them, you arrived. Some were intentionally fake, built into mirrored walls to maintain symmetry. Others were real but locked forever, just to make you wonder what they were hiding. The answer was often a broom. Baroque doors were more than entrances. They were declarations, poems, warnings, occasionally threats. A Baroque door didn't say, "Come in." It said, "Prepare yourself," even if it only led to a hallway. The Enlightenment and the rise of the rational door. Eventually, people got tired of gold leaves, tired of carved angels, tired of trying to walk through a door without tripping over someone's family crest. Welcome to the Enlightenment, the moment in history when doors said, "Let's calm down." This was the 18th century, the age of reason, order, geometry, and powdered wigs that defied physics. Architecture followed suit. The swirling excess of the Baroque gave way to the straight lines of neoclassicism, and doors were no exception. Gone were the screaming cherubs, gone were the angry lions. Now, columns, rectangles, balance, purpose. Enlightenment doors were clean, symmetrical, and, above all, intelligent. They didn't shout, they suggested. They didn't demand reverence, they offered context. Frames were elegant, proportions were perfect. If a door was arched, it was mathematically satisfying. Many entrances were inspired by ancient Rome and Greece, but filtered through a calm, educated lens. The Enlightenment door said, "Yes, we admire the ancients. No, we don't need to wear a toga indoors." This was also the golden age of the front stoop. A few steps leading up to the door, elevating it both physically and socially. The stoop was not just a landing, it was a platform for reasoned arrival. The materials also changed: mahogany, oak, walnut, less about being flashy, more about being correct. A proper Enlightenment door had a central handle, a well-proportioned frame, possibly a fanlight, a semicircular window above the door to let light in and metaphorically represent Enlightenment itself. Yes, they even made the light over the door philosophical. Locks became more precise, hinges improved. The act of opening a door became smoother, more silent. Because who has time for squeaking when you're pondering civil liberties? This was also when doors inside homes began to feel permanent, not just functional. They were designed into the house, aligned with furniture, sight lines, and the ideals of domestic flow. Some were hidden in paneling, others framed by bookshelves, but all of them deliberate. And for once in history, even poor people started getting nice doors. Urbanization and early industrial production made it possible to get mass-produced doors that still looked dignified. The middle class had arrived, and it came with hinges that didn't insult your ears. It was also the start of door etiquette. Knock, don't shout. Wait, don't walk in. Close the door behind you or your entire household philosophy collapses. In short, the Enlightenment gave us the first truly civilized door. Not because it was beautiful, not because it was powerful, but because it fit the idea of what a door should be. Reasonable, respectable, reproducible, and finally, quiet. The industrial door, efficiency, iron, and noise. The 19th century didn't care about symbolism, it cared about output. Factories didn't need doors that whispered, they needed doors that slammed, repeatedly, in sync with the production schedule. The Industrial Revolution redefined architecture, and the door followed. What once had been carved and admired was now cast and standardized. Iron, steel, mass-produced wood panels, thousands of doors, all identical, rolling off the same machine like uniformed soldiers of privacy. These were not romantic doors. They didn't tell stories. They filed reports. Warehouse doors grew enormous, wide enough for wagons, machines, later trucks. They slid, they folded, they groaned mechanically. If a door was quiet, it was broken. Homes, too, began using mass-manufactured doors, flat panels, machine-cut moldings. You could now choose between 4 styles: plain, slightly raised, slightly more raised, Victorian, overconfidence team. Victorian doors were solid, dark-stained, and slightly overcomplicated, like the furniture, the clothing, and the family rules. Middle-class homes had parlors, studies, and dining rooms, each with their own door, because formality was now affordable. The servant's door reappeared, hidden in back corridors, perfectly painted to match the wall, because nothing says class like pretending your butler doesn't exist. In cities, apartment doors began to multiply vertically, whole stairwells of identical rectangles, each one a portal to someone else's version of stress. And for the first time, doors became part of bureaucracy, room numbers, nameplates, do not disturb signs, early peepholes, apartment buzzers that only worked on odd days. And with these developments came the one innovation that would define modern door experience: the office door. A flat panel with a frosted glass window and black letters that said manager, dentist, or knock before entering. The office door wasn't about mystery, it was about separation. Between worker and boss, between public and private, between you and the man who always ate tuna in meetings. This was also the age of institutional doors. Hospitals, banks, schools, police stations, all had doors you weren't sure you were allowed to open. If you hesitated at a door in the 19th century, it was probably designed that way. But the door didn't stop there. It kept getting smarter and more automatic. By the early 20th century, we were already seeing doors that opened on motion, or pushed with minimal effort, or swung both ways, like they couldn't decide. The door was adapting to speed, to flow, to the needs of people who no longer had time to knock. Privacy wasn't vanishing, it was becoming managed. Glass, automation, and the disappearing boundary. At some point in the 20th century, doors got tired of being seen, so they became glass. Transparency was the new power. If your front door could show the world your foyer, your tile, and part of your anxious dog, you were winning. But glass didn't mean fragile. Modern doors got stronger, tempered, laminated, double-paned, able to survive storms, burglars, and delivery drivers who knocked like they were mad at the building. The office door evolved too. Glass panels, nameplates, card readers, no longer knocked on, just buzzed, scanned, or gently nodded at until someone inside took pity. Privacy wasn't gone, it just got filtered, frosted, tinted, motion activated. In shopping malls and airports, doors stopped asking you to open them at all. They opened for you before you even knew you were ready. No contact, no consent, just silent obedience. Motion sensors became the butlers of modern life. Step near and the glass panels slide apart with a hiss that says, "Welcome, please spend." Automatic doors became so common that manual doors started feeling suspicious. Why is this door heavy? Why do I have to pull? Am I even allowed in? We started reading the door's resistance as a kind of judgment. Oh, this isn't for me. This is a real door. In homes, minimalism took over. Flat panels, hidden hinges, invisible frames. Modern doors were designed to disappear, to blend into walls, to erase thresholds, to quietly mutter, "Don't look at me, I'm just a wall in denial." Smart locks emerged, Bluetooth, fingerprints, keypads, apps. Now, your front door could text you from work and say, "You left me open again." Or worse, someone tried to open me and failed. And you stared at the notification 5 miles away, wondering if it was a burglar, the cat, or the wind having an opinion. Digital peepholes appeared, cameras, facial recognition. No longer did you look through a hole. You looked at your phone while your door looked at them. And sometimes it told you not to bother. Doors had become filters of people, of access, of behavior. They no longer existed just to open or close. They existed to decide, to log, to remember, and sometimes to silently judge. The final door and the meaning of entry. In the end, all doors are the same. A frame, a panel, a question. To enter or not. To open or to wait. To knock or simply walk away. For thousands of years, doors have separated inside from outside, the protected from the public, the private from the passing, the quiet from the questions. But a door is more than wood or iron or tempered glass. It's a decision, and every culture has answered it differently. Some make doors grand, others hide them. Some leave them open, others lock them tight and forget where the key went. In some places, a door is a formality, a thing you walk through without thinking. In others, it's a boundary with rules, rituals, and deep unspoken meaning. Some doors are guarded, some doors guard themselves. Some doors never open at all. A door can mean welcome. It can also mean no. It can signal hospitality, or danger, or surprise, or just, "Give me 5 minutes." But here's the thing, a door doesn't care. It's just there, waiting, quietly doing its job, holding one world apart from another until someone decides to pass through. And when they do, the door moves, it shifts, it swings, it allows, and then it closes. Back to stillness, back to being not a thing at all until the next visitor comes and wonders, "Should I knock?" You made it. One topic, dozens of doors. Absolutely no reason this had to be this long, and yet, here we are. Thank you for walking through it. Slowly, quietly, and with intention.